Well, it's a great joy to be with you. Talking about rich apologetics. Before I want to do anything else, I want to actually just say what apologetics is, because it is completely okay if you don't know what that term means. It simply is providing a defense for the Christian faith, okay? It's providing a defense, providing evidence for the Christian faith, because here's the thing. Our faith is built on evidence. That's things that are actually we can know, and we can defend our faith on the basis of evidence. That's one of the things about the Christian faith. It's not something in which you just feel it or have an experience. It's something for which there is real evidence. And here's what I want to focus on tonight, and that is the ways in which the church is evidence for the Christian faith. Now, you may have thought of a lot of other things, and there are a lot of other things that give us an idea of evidence for the Christian faith, but sometimes we don't realize that our church is actually evidence for the Christian faith. And that's what I want us to talk about and explore this evening. And just thank you for letting me be here, and greetings from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, as well as Sojourn Church Midtown, where I have the privilege of serving as one of the pastors. Well, I want to start out talking about student ministry a little bit. This morning, we found out and we talked about how your pastor started out as a student minister. And I want to tell you something that you probably have already figured out, and that is student ministry is always full of surprises. Now, sometimes I wouldn't tell some of the surprises, but let's face it, we've already talked about peanut butter and armpits this morning, so you don't get much further than that. So I'm just talking about some of the surprises that I've faced as a student minister in the 1990s. I remember one of the surprises that I met in student ministry was there was a point at which I had this game going on in which I would put in a paper bag food items or one or two food items, and people would wager on how many bites it would take them to get whatever was in that bag down, okay? And so I'd give prizes for this. And so I had a girl in the student ministry. This is not a recommendation for doing these things, by the way. I had a girl in the student ministry, and she said, whatever is in that bag, I can get it down in one bite. Well, what I had put in this particular bag was a package of the powdered mix for Kool-Aid in blueberry. It was blue Kool-Aid, okay? And it was the powdered package, family size. And she said, I can do it in one bite. So to her credit, she did. She took that and took it all down in one gulp all the way down. She took this. The problem is it didn't stay down. And not only did it not stay down, but I had just fed the students a copious amount of pizza, and it was blue. And about 3 or 4 seconds later, she projectile shot out neon blue pizza that was all over the wall. That is a surprise in student ministry, okay? That's right up there with peanut butter in the armpits, right there. That is right up there. I mean, surprises in student ministry. Another one that I remember, again, these are not recommendations. These are saying, don't do this, okay? We had this song, I don't know if you remember it or not, but it was a song that was relatively short-lived, thankfully, called Romans 16:19 says, and as you said, Romans 16:19 says, everybody would jump up and down. It was just a short-lived song in student ministry in the 90s, and one of they got a little out of hand, and one of them, I saw him, I'm standing up there playing guitar, I see him sail through the air, and he goes through the wall. I mean, and I don't mean through the wall like he made a dent in the wall. I mean like Winnie the Pooh and Rabbit's house through the wall. And so I did the only thing I knew to do. I pulled him out of the wall, covered it up with a very large poster, and told the students never to mention this to anyone again. Now, a few weeks later, actually, I felt really so guilty about this. I told the deacons, went through all the things that you have to go through when you tell the deacons that you knocked a hole through the wall of the youth room and you covered it up with a poster. But none of those surprises in student ministry really prepared me for a surprise that I faced a few months ago, much more recently, when I was serving for a time as an interim student minister in our church. And here's what I discovered when this surprise happened, that the doubts that people have changed. The doubts that people have about the Christian faith have changed. There has been a change in the past decade or so, especially in the doubts that students have about the faith, and the doubts that students are having are the doubts that adults are either having or going to have. It's changed what people doubt. You see, back in the 90s when I was doing student ministry, when the students doubted, they usually, first off, didn't start doubting till college. And when they did, what they were doubting was whether or not the miracles in the Bible really happened, and whether or not the Bible was reliable. That's what people were doubting and wondering about in the 1990s. And even if they didn't do what the Bible said, they at the very least assumed that Christianity is good for the world. They assumed that Christianity is something that is good for the world. But now, the doubts start in a different place than they did before. And I want to tell you about one particular young woman that really exemplified this for me. She came to me and said that she found the evidence for the resurrection to be compelling. She said, I believe that the resurrection happened and that there's evidence for it. Now, when I was a youth minister in the 90s, what that meant is next, well, let's pray together. Let's get you to discipleship class. You're ready to go. Let's go with this. But then she said, but I don't want to become a Christian unless the church can affirm my bisexual identity. And if the church can't affirm my bisexual identity, I'm willing to disbelieve the resurrection, even though I just admitted there's good evidence for it. Now, this is something I never envisioned in the 90s when I was a student minister. Of somebody saying, I'm not going to accept the evidence that I admit is there unless the church can affirm this conception I have of myself as bisexual. And in her mind, if the church didn't affirm her identity that she perceived about herself, we were disregarding her human dignity, we were devaluing her psychological well-being, and the evidence that we were presenting was irrelevant because she saw our ethics as immoral. That is a different set of doubts than I faced 30 years ago. But that is the set of doubts that we are facing today in defending the Christian faith. Those are the things that we are facing as we defend the Christian faith. This isn't just, though, something that is happening at the level of the youth ministry. This is happening at much bigger levels as well. There's in the United Kingdom, there was a tribunal that met because there was a British general practitioner, a doctor named David Macareth. And he said that he could not use pronouns to describe somebody that conflicted with their birth gender. He said, I can't do this in good conscience. And when he was taken before a tribunal trying to get his job back after being fired, he was told that your belief in Genesis 1:27, your lack of belief in transgenderism, and your objection to transgenderism are incompatible with human dignity. In other words, it's saying that Christianity, historic Christianity, is immoral. We're standing against human dignity according to this way of thinking. This is a fundamentally different challenge that we now face as Christians. And I wish to understand that, because what's basically happened, I've laid it out right here in a way that I hope is helpful for you. Beginning in the modern era, 17th century and later, what people began to doubt were the miracles. Now, people still doubt the miracles. But then people at that point began to respond by giving scientific and historical evidence. Then, sometime in the 18th, 19th century, people began to doubt metaphysics. Now, I don't want to get into what that means, but it has to do with what is possible, what is real in the realm beyond what you can see. And so people responded with a defense of Christian worldview. And you hear that a lot, worldview. Where does all this worldview? That's because we're trying to defend that Christianity is a comprehensive worldview that can explain the world as we see it and beyond what we see. And people are still questioning that. But here's the new challenge we have. is there are doubts about the morality of Christianity. Is Christianity even moral? Or are we people who are doubting, denying, defying people's dignity and the way they want to live their lives? And are we immoral for the questions we raise about that? That is the new challenge that we are facing as we present the Christian faith to people. Apologetics has become less about looking for evidence outside the Bible to show that the Bible's true, and it's more about rightly interpreting the Bible to show that the truth of the Bible is good. We have to be able to defend that the truth of the Bible is good. And so what do we do? Given all these things that we're talking about, wrestling with, what do we do? How do Christians respond to this? Because here's the thing. We have to change the way we defend the faith. Now, that's not because the Christian faith has changed. James chapter 1, we serve a God in whom there is no shadow of change or turning, right? We serve a God who truth doesn't change. But the challenges we face have changed, and therefore we have to be able to meet a new set of challenges. So here's what I want to do tonight. I want to equip you to be able to face the new set of challenges that is doubting the very goodness of Christianity. Now, in answering this question, how do we answer this? How do we do this? How do we respond in different ways? How do we change this? I got the answer to this on an airplane flight to the Dominican Republic a few years ago. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't listened to a safety briefing on the airplane for several years. I mean, I don't know about you, but I think we're all that way. We don't listen to that safety briefing. They're giving the safety briefing, and we do not listen to this at all. We sit there, we put our headphones on, we read, whatever. We do not listen to the safety briefing, do we? And part of it is because we've heard it before, but part of it is they tell us things that I'm like, do you know something I don't know? Because I was on a flight from Louisville to Atlanta, and they're telling me about what to do in case of a water landing. Do they know something about the geography between Louisville and Atlanta that I don't? Because I don't know of any places where there's a place to land a plane in water between Louisville and Atlanta. And they're telling me about how to do a water landing right there. But I'm on the plains of the Dominican Republic. Dominican Republic, there's significant water between Louisville and the Dominican Republic. And so I'm sitting there, and for the first time in years, I listened to the safety briefing. And there's a phrase that person at the safety briefing said that I think is really important. She said, the exit door you're looking for could be behind you. The exit door you're looking for could be behind you. And I reflected on that for a little bit. You see, we always assume that what we're looking for is in front of us, is ahead of us. We assume that. And so we do that on an airplane in an emergency. We assume that what I'm looking for must be that way. And she's reminding us, what if the exit door you're looking for isn't in front of you, but it's behind you? And you may think, what on earth does this have to do with apologetics? Well, here's what this has to do with apologetics. Here's what it has to do with defending the Christian faith. You see, there are people who, as they look at these challenges that we're facing today, they say things like Christianity must change or die. We've got to adapt to the culture. We've got to change what we believe so that we fit the culture, or Christianity's just going to die out. We've got to change Christianity. We've got to change what we believe. We've got to change what we say is right and wrong, or we're going to die as the church. You see what they're saying? They're assuming that the exit door they're looking for is in front of them. We got to look at what the culture's doing up there. We got to change to fit that. But what if the exit door we're looking for is actually behind us? And here's what I mean by that. Do you realize that over 2,000 years of church history, there have been other times when the world thought that Christianity was immoral? And so the question is, why don't we look back at those times? And one of the primary times that the world around the Christian faith thought that the Christian faith was immoral was in the 1st and the 2nd centuries AD. They thought that Christianity was immoral. You think, I didn't realize that. I want to help you understand some things about the world of the New Testament and the century after the New Testament that you may not have recognized. You see, they had a very religious society. We'll talk about this more in a little bit. They had a very religious society. The Romans had a very religious society. But here's the thing. You didn't have to believe in the gods of Rome to do sacrifices to the gods of Rome. You may not realize that. People, vast numbers of people, particularly the philosophers, they went to the temples, they did the sacrifices, and they actually didn't believe in the gods. They didn't believe in them. They did the sacrifices, but did not believe in those gods at all. You didn't have to do that. But those sacrifices that were done in the temples, they were what bound the society together and gave wishes of blessing and goodness to your neighbors. And so this group of people, the Christians, they started saying, we are not going to go to the pagan temples. We are not going to participate in the pagan sacrifices. Do you realize how ridiculous that seemed? Because people are saying, you don't have to believe in the gods. I don't believe in the gods. You don't have to believe in them. Just do it even if you don't believe in it. And Christians said no. And in the minds and in the eyes of their neighbors, what Christians were saying by that is we do not want to bind our society together, and we don't want to wish blessings on our neighbors. And so Christianity began to be perceived as something that was immoral, wrong, bad for society. We have a time before us when Christianity began to be viewed as bad for society. And so here's what I want us to do. I want us to look at how the church responded to that in the first and the second centuries, and to see that perhaps that exit door we're looking for, how it might be behind us. In the first and second century, we're going to see three things. We're going to see first that the life that the church lived required power that God alone could give. We're going to see that Christians did radical civic good while refusing to bow to the civic gods. And we're going to see that Christians had a consistency between their profession and their practice. And we're going to see that those three things that we're going to unpack tonight, those God worked through them to change the world. So let's jump in and take a look at this. This first one, this first thing. So here's kind of the overarching picture is the morality of Christianity was challenged. Early Christians presented the life of the church as the evidence for the truth of the faith. And the first truth that I want us to see that Christians practiced in this is they recognized that the life the church lived required power that God alone could give. Let me tell you about one of my favorite people, early church, 2nd century. There's a guy named Aristides of Athens. I spent a lot of time studying this guy, Aristides. He's somebody that not a lot of people have studied, but he's a guy named Aristides. And Aristides was a philosopher, a Greek philosopher, a well-respected, well-regarded Greek philosopher who became a Christian and kept being a philosopher even after that. And he wrote an early defense of the Christian faith, trying to plead for Christians to be accepted in the midst of Roman intolerance. And here is his main argument. It's brilliant. He says the way that Christians care for each other is unexplainable unless there's a power of a God among them. Some God has to be working through them for them to care for each other in the ways that they care for each other. The lives they're living, the ethics they're living with, you can't explain that unless there is a supernatural power at work among them. Now, to make this argument, he starts with morals that the Romans, even if they didn't believe them or practice them, they would have recognized them, like do not commit adultery, judge with justice, do not covet. He works through those. But then he starts talking about how Christians live a life that they are so radically generous to one another that it is absurd to the world around them. That they are radically generous to one another. He says, if their number is imprisoned or oppressed, all of them provide his needs and deliver him if possible. He says that Christians care for each other. Once you're a Christian, people care for you. And he says that is not explainable apart from some supernatural power at work. Did you know there were comedy writers in the 1st and 2nd century? You may not realize that. You think comedy is some new invention or something. No, there are serious comedians in the 2nd century. One of them, his most popular, we call him a stand-up comedian of his day, was a guy named Lucian of Samosata. Lucian of Samosata was a very, very popular comedian in the 2nd century. And here's what happens with Lucian. He writes this work in which he describes a man who was a philosopher, and this philosopher he described, this guy, went and became a Christian and faked it, and then ended up getting thrown in jail. And this guy has an entire comedy routine, Lucian of Samosata describing this, making fun of Christians because of how Christians cared for this person who had faked becoming a Christian and gotten thrown in jail. He has a whole comedy routine on this. He is making fun of Christians because of the way that Christians care for each other. He has a whole comedy routine on that. Why? Because that was absolutely absurd from the perspective of the world around Christians at that time. That you would care for people who are weak, that you would care for people who were oppressed, that you would care for people who were marginalized in any way. If you would do that, that was absurd from the perspective of the Romans. It was crazy that someone would do that. And yet Christians, if any one of their number had needs, they made sure that they cared for those needs. And Aristides, in this defense I mentioned, he says, look, only God's power, only the power that is supernatural can possibly explain how people would possibly care for one another in this particular way. Wow. What Aristides basically says is, look, what would it take for a community to care for each other in this way? And here's what he says in response to that. He says, as I look at how Christians care for each other, I see that truly this is a new people and there is something divine mingled among them. That is such a beautiful statement. He says, I look at how Christians care for each other and I see that there is something divine going on right there. I see that there is. And you remember, this is something that's grounded in the New Testament. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 3. The author of Hebrews says, remember those who are in prison as if you are there too. Remember those who are oppressed because you are one body with them. Care for your fellow Christians. And that is an evidence for the truth of the faith. He's saying here that it is impossible to care for one another in the way Christians do apart from supernatural power among them. Now, what does this mean for us today? What does this mean for us today? How could we show the world that there's a power among us by the way we care for each other? I think there's so many things we could mention. One of the things that comes to my mind is based on another apologist from the 2nd century. His name is Justin. Justin Martyr is what he becomes known as, but he was martyred at the end of his life. He was just known as Justin for most of his life. And hear what he says. He says, in the church, we who once despised and destroyed each other and refused to hold anything in common with people who were not as the same tribe as us due to differing customs, we now live in common with people who were once alienated from us. Man, do you realize, hear what he's saying there? He's saying people from different ethnicities and social classes are now in the church together. And he says that shows how we care for one another, how we bring people together in the church who are different from one another. And I think that argument still works. I think we ought to look at our churches and think about and consider what that means for us, because we have the capacity in the church to bring together people who are different and unite them in Christ. Do you realize we have the capacity to do that? And think about this for a moment. If naturalistic evolution is really the way that we explain everything, if that were really true, do you realize that the best way for us to get by and survive is to always favor people who are like ourselves? That's the best way to get by. Favor people who are like yourself. Get in a tribe where you can fight against other people and only favor people who are like yourself. In fact, one philosopher of science, Anthony O'Hear, British philosopher of science, says, if evolution is true as the explanation, here's what we ought to do. Favor kith and kin, do down our enemies, ignore the starving, and let the weakest go to the wall. That's what we ought to do. Christians do the opposite. And when we bring together people who are different from ourselves, we are doing that in a way that the world wishes they could and can't. You see, the world's failing at this. I mean, I'm not talking about just a Christian perspective. If you look at the way the world is doing in their diversity, equity, and inclusion statistics, you could go to Harvard Business Review. One of the things as you look that up in Harvard Business Review is they are lamenting over and over all of our DEI initiatives aren't working. They don't work. We want this. We want to bring together people who are different, but we're failing at doing this. We're failing at it. But what if in our churches we became people who were accomplishing by the power of the gospel what they are incapable of doing with all of their millions of dollars of initiatives? We can. We can. The world wants to do this, but they are failing miserably at doing this. They're failing at it. And yet we have an answer and a solution. We can bring together people who are different on the basis of the gospel. We can do that. It is possible for us to do that and to pursue that. And I want to challenge us to think, how can we make our churches more multi-ethnic, multi-socioeconomic, multi-generational? How can we bring together more people who are different from one another to show the world we can do something by the gospel that you want to do, but you are failing at doing? The exit door you're looking for may be behind you. And back in the 1st and 2nd century, one of the things they recognized is we are bringing people together in a way that defends the truth of the faith. We are bringing them together and caring for people different from one another. And that demonstrates the truth of the gospel that we are proclaiming. One of my favorite texts in this is Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 10. I love Ephesians 3:10. It says there that God bringing the Jews and the Gentiles together reveals, and it uses this word that's really fun to say in Greek, polypoikalos. It's a fun word to say, polypoikalos. But polypoikalos is multicolored, multifaceted. It's used in other Greek literature when they're weaving together a tapestry and using different colors of thread, and that tapestry is how it's used. He says, when you bring the Jews and the Gentiles together, it reveals the multicolored, multifaceted, manifold wisdom of God. I love that. That's beautiful. That's what we're supposed to be doing in the church, is bringing people who are different together to reveal God's multicolored, multifaceted, manifold wisdom. I've had the privilege of serving as a pastor at a church at Sojourn Church Midtown, which is in the inner city in Louisville. Pastoral team, multi-ethnic pastoral team, 3 languages every Sunday. We're translating into Korean, into Spanish, and have English. Every single Sunday, all of our services are done in different languages. And just relatively recently, a few months ago, we had what we called Roots and Recipes. And it was basically everybody brings something that represents your roots. Come together. Let's have roots and recipes. And we all brought together foods that represented our roots. And our family brought different things from our Midwest background, and we came together, and there were casseroles there. There were those salads that aren't really salads, but we call them salads that are made of Jell-O and whipped topping, those like that. There were those type of amazing things. There was baked macaroni and cheese. There were kimchi pancakes. There was Argentinian food there. The most strange item was this stuff that North Carolina people call barbecue, but they put vinegar in it. Like, I'm sure there's something in the Old Testament about that. That's just wrong. They need to repent. But that's really multicultural for me right there, is this idea of putting vinegar in barbecue. All this being brought together, and what occurred to me in the midst of that is this is a taste of what God wants to do in eternity. And we are showing the world, this is what the world wants. to bring together all these cultures and to be able to enjoy together. That's what the world wants, and it is falling on its face and can't do it. But that is an evidence for the truthfulness of Christianity. It is an evidence. Now, if you're interested in more about that, I've just written an entire book on this called In Church as It Is in Heaven. And I'd be glad to talk about that more on this, about how that is an argument for the truth of Christianity. But let's move on to the second of these points, and it's simply this, is that not only were Christians doing good to each other, they were doing good for the world. The church was practicing radical civic good while refusing to bow to the civic gods. And remember, as I hinted at already, for the ancient Romans, the way that you did good for your neighbors was to venerate the civic gods, okay? That's how you did good for your neighbors. That's how you blessed your neighbors, is by doing the worship of the civic gods. That's how you did it. But Christians, they wouldn't do that. So their neighbors saw them as a threat to the social order. So Aristides and others, as they're arguing for the truth of the Christian faith, they say, we want to show you we are doing more good for the world than you are. We're doing more good. They said, first off, we pray. And one of the things you find in some of these early defenders of the Christian faith is to say, look, if we weren't praying, God would have already judged you. God would have already brought the end if we weren't praying. But then they go on and they talk about how they are doing good for the social order. Let me give you some of the examples of this. They, according to one apologist, actually to several people, it said they rescued orphans from those who abused them. Let me tell you about something you may not realize. In the ancient world, in the Roman Empire, there was a practice called expositio. Expositio was the practice of taking a child that was unacknowledged by its father and simply abandoning the child outside the city. It was an incredibly common practice. It was perfectly legal. It was perfectly approved because a child didn't exist until a father acknowledged the child. In their legal system, their way of thinking, the child did not exist until the father acknowledged the child. So the child could just be taken outside, this infant, laid outside the city to die. Most of these children were gathered up by slavers and by persons who would put them into prostitution, is what happened to most of these children. Christians went out and gathered these children up, rescuing the orphans from those who abused them. This is something that Christians have said that we're known for this. You know we do this. You know that we go and we rescue the orphans. And they did this because they believed every human being was equally dignified and created in God's image. And I don't know if you realize how radical that is. You see, we in Western culture have been so soaked by the Christian tradition in certain ways that we assume the human dignity of every person. Let me tell you, the Romans did not assume that. They did not assume any intrinsic dignity. Your dignity was based on your household, particularly your father. That was what your dignity was based on. And there were people who did not matter at all any more than an animal in their eyes, because they did not have any notion that a human being has intrinsic dignity. Christians did. They went out and they gathered up these children unacknowledged by any father. But not only that, the Christians, it says in some of these texts, they shared without boasting with those who had nothing. They shared without boasting to those who had nothing. And even 2 centuries later, that one of the reasons that people stayed Christian and refused to go back to the pagan gods is because that they saw how Christians were caring for others. There's an emperor named Emperor Julian. In the 4th century, he tries to turn the Roman Empire back to paganism. And he complains to a priest. He says, nobody's coming back to paganism. He says, I can't get people to come back to worshiping the Roman gods. They won't do it. And here's the reason he gives. He says, why don't we just notice it's their benevolence to stray, speaking of the Christians, their care for the dead, and the apparent holiness of their lives that have done the most to increase their number. He's frustrated. He says, the way they care for people causes the others not to want to go back to the pagan gods. Because you go back to the pagan gods and you know that you're not going to be cared for. They're doing good even for those who aren't Christians, but they're also doing good to one another. They're doing good for society. And so he's saying that the argument is that Christians are actually doing more good than their Roman neighbors. And therefore, we shouldn't criticize the Christians because they're not worshiping the pagan gods, because look at all the good they are doing. And now the questions today are somewhat different from this. But there are real questions about Christianity that are similar to this. There are people who wonder, how can you say you're doing civic good if you won't wear the pride badge, if you won't use the preferred pronouns? How can you possibly do civic good if you are somebody who holds to Christian values in this area? How can you possibly? How can you possibly be somebody who in any way is doing any civic good? How should we respond? Well, when the Romans questioned how Christians could possibly be doing civic good, what they pointed to is said, look at the ways we care for the world around us. Look at the ways we care for impoverished children. And here's what I would love to encourage. I loved hearing what I heard this morning about what you're doing to do with helping families avoid their children ending up in foster care to begin with. That's beautiful and that's good, and it's the type of thing I'm talking about here in this. Because what if we became as widely known for the good we do for children and for the vulnerable, as widely known for that as we are for our stand against the progressive sexual agendas? See, I'm not saying we back off from our stand on one side. I'm saying let's make sure that we are as widely known for the way we care for the vulnerable as we are for the stand we take about sexual issues. Can we be as widely known for one as the other? Because that's what's happening right here in the early church. They were widely known because they didn't go to the pagan temples and worship the pagan gods. They were widely known for that. But they only have to point to a few things, and it's pretty clear that the world around them knew them just as much for how they lived in relation to the poor, the marginalized, the children, the orphans. They knew them as much for that as they knew them for their morals. That's what we want. That's what we should want today in our world today. See, the early apologists, they weren't just describing that the church was doing the same civic good that the world was doing. They were saying the church is doing something better than the world is doing. And so should we. A hospitality, a generosity so rich, they could not fit it into the world's categories. The last thing I want us to look at is to how in the early church, the church's life called for consistency between profession and practice. As I said earlier, it's difficult for us to understand how absurd it seemed for Christians not to worship the pagan gods. Civic religion of this worship of the pagan gods, it saturated all of life. When you walked in the entryway of your house, you would have a small image called a lares, and you would touch that as you went by to acknowledge the spirits of your ancestors. When you were at a dinner, you would take the cup of wine, or if you're a Baptist, grape juice. You take a cup of wine, and you would tip a little bit of that out, and that was a sacrifice to a god or goddess who was considered to be the patron of this banquet. You would just pour that out. There was also, just to see how much all of life was saturated with the religion, there was the ritual of the sacred chicken. I'm not even making this up. I'm totally not. I know you think sacred chicken, you think Chick-fil-A, that's what you think, but they had a ritual of the sacred chicken, and this is actually for real, the ritual of the sacred chicken. And so before a commander in the military went out to battle, they would get a chicken, and they would sprinkle some food on the ground, some feed for the chicken, and set the chicken in the middle of it. And if the chicken ate some of the feed, then that meant that the gods were wanting him to go into battle. But if the chicken didn't eat of that, then they would know that the gods didn't want them to go into battle. It was the ritual of the sacred chicken. And so they would have this ritual. Now, one Roman general, as you know, if you've dealt with chickens at all, chickens are stupid. They really are. And so he got tired of waiting on the chicken to eat, and he wanted to go into battle. And so he grabbed the chicken by the feet, walked over to the shore, threw it out into threw it out in there. Chickens apparently don't swim particularly well either. And so he throws it out in there and says, "Well, if it won't eat, then at least it's going to drink." That's what he said. And then he went into battle and was spectacularly defeated. So don't mess with the chicken ritual. Okay, but there's just gives you an example of how religion, the religion of the gods, was part of every part of life. Now, as I said, you didn't have to believe in the gods, but you did the rituals and you did them right for the sake of binding society together. And Christians wouldn't do something unless they believed it. They wouldn't do it unless they believed it. A few months ago, I was at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and I was doing translations of some ancient Greek texts from the second to the 5th century, particularly one. And I ran across when I was there something that I'd heard about before, but I'd not seen one before. Now, see, when people think they hear you're translating ancient texts, here's what they think it looks like, okay? That's what they think. They think you're somehow running from somebody and you translate this ancient text. They think of that. That's not how it really looks when you translate an ancient text. When you translate an ancient text, it looks more like this, okay? A lot of boring drudgery staring at a page, okay? That's what it actually looks like. But in the midst of all this drudgery of staring at pages of Greek text and trying to figure out what this ancient scribe, how he was copying this and how he was laying this out and the abbreviations he was using, things like that. And I was looking at several different ones. I ran across this one type of document that I'd read about, but I'd never actually seen one before. It's called a libellus. That's one type of libellus. There are actually multiple types of libelli in the ancient world, but this is one type of it. And it was a statement from about 250 AD, the year we would call 250 AD. And it was a statement saying, "I've sacrificed to the gods," and it was signed by the governor of this region. And you may think, what is the big deal about these? These are a huge deal in the 3rd century. And here's why they're such a big deal. Is because Christians were being persecuted, and you could prove you weren't a Christian by having one of these on you. Because you said it's a certificate saying, "I've sacrificed to the gods. I sacrificed to them, and therefore I must not be a Christian, and therefore don't arrest me for being a Christian because I got this. I got a sacrifice certificate." This particular one that I read, it says, "To the officials in charge of the sacrifices from Aurelius, we have always been constant in sacrificing to the gods." This person is trying to declare, "We've never been a Christian at all. Our family's not Christian at all. Don't bother us. We have the sacrifice certificate to show this." Now here's why this is a fascinating thing in so many ways. Is because it reveals the degree to which early Christians would not do something that they didn't believe. Now, there are exceptions. You can find instances where Christians actually forged these, or instances where Christians actually did sacrifices and things like that, but those were the exceptions. These worked precisely because Christians said, "We will not do that which we do not believe. We don't do this, what we don't believe." And as we look at this, as I think about this, what it reveals is something really important about Christianity, is that it, unlike those pagan religions, it was supposed to be a coherent commitment between what you believed and what you practiced. Our faith is internally coherent. Internally coherent. That is to say, it agrees with itself internally. Again, the gods and goddesses of the pagans and all of that, they could have all sorts of contradictions in their stories, and the people didn't care. We care. We care. We believe that what the Bible says agrees with what the Bible says in one place, it agrees with what it says in another place. We believe that what we believe about the Bible has to agree with what the Bible says. That is a radical thought in the ancient world. People didn't actually practice or live that way. But we do, and we have as Christians. So what does this mean for us today? Well, first off, Don't back down from believing the Bible is without error. Can I just say that? We need to say that. Never back down from that. It is essential to what we believe that this book, this scripture, it agrees with itself. It doesn't contradict itself. It doesn't contradict reality. That's what we're saying when we believe the Bible is without error or inerrant. We believe that the Bible speaks the truth and that it agrees with itself. And I say that because there are people today increasingly who want to say that maybe we should unhitch the Old Testament from the New Testament. Maybe we should just say the Old Testament is something we can write off. Or there's even people who call themselves red letter Christians, only believing the words that Jesus said, but not the rest of the Bible. No. We believe that the whole of Scripture agrees with itself and with reality, and it tells the truth. We don't cut it up into parts and say we're going to ignore this part. No, we believe it is coherent. Early Christians believed that it was coherent. They believed that their practices had to fit their profession and that their profession was true. And they were willing to die for it. They were willing to die for that. And just as a side note, if somebody says, I just believe the red letters, do you recognize that in the red letters that Jesus says he believes the black letters? He says, Luke chapter 24, verse 44, that the entirety of the Old Testament is true and it's about him. John chapter 10, verse 35, the scriptures, speaking of the Old Testament, cannot be broken. So if you're a red letter Christian, you better be a black letter Christian too. Because in the red letters, it says Jesus believed the black letters. And not to mention the fact that if you say you believe Jesus, but then you say, I don't believe what Jesus said he believed, then do you really believe Jesus? If you don't believe what Jesus said he believed. We believe this text through and through. But not only that, it's not just that there's an internal coherence, there is, within our faith, but an external coherence. What we practice and do should fit what we believe. That's what I'm saying, what we're trying to understand and see in this. And that means that what we say about people, about others, what we do, it has to fit what we really believe. And there's so much pressure being put on us right now to outwardly, maybe in the t-shirt you wear to work or the pronouns you use or something like that, to say outwardly, to express outwardly something you know isn't true. And we're called, though, to be people when our practice matches our profession. What we believe that God has said, we say that, we practice that outwardly. And I want us to see that, to understand that. And when we do this, we can be hospitable and kind. We don't have to be mean. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, I love what it says there. It says, do what you do in defending the faith with meekness and fear. Meekness and fear. Now, I want us to pause and think about that. If you got your Bibles, look, 1 Peter 3:15, meekness and fear, or gentleness and respect. There's different ways that it's translated. But understand that meekness is not weakness. Meekness is not weakness. Meekness is saying, I have power, but I will choose to direct it in a way that is gentle and kind. But then it says fear or reverence. That means reverence to God, fear of God, okay? Is what it's speaking of there. That we are to live lives in which we are gentle and kind to our neighbors when we disagree with them. But we do what we do in the fear of God. We say, I can't compromise this because I'm under the fear of God. And we've got to recognize that our apologetics, our defense, needs to be done with meekness, kindness, gentleness, and also fear. Those aren't contradictory. But I'll tell you something. It's easy to do one of those, but not the other. It's easy to say, I'm going to be just kind and meek all the time, but not live in the fear of God. Or it's easy to say, I'm going to be about the fear of God, but not be kind and meek and gentle. It's really hard to do both. And yet what we are called to do and to be as the people of God is both of those. To be gentle, kind, but also do what we do in the fear of God, recognizing I must outwardly do what I inwardly profess. Both of those at the same time, both of those have to be part of the way we live at the same time. Both of those at the same time. And so what the early Christians did that we see, that we've looked at here, is that they cared for one another in a way that couldn't be explained apart from the power of God. We saw, secondly, they did civic good while still refusing to bow to the civic gods. And thirdly, they lived lives of consistency between what they said and what they practiced, what they believed and what they did. They lived lives of consistency. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, man, if we do all those things you just said, will that mean that the world is just going to love us? No, it does not mean that. In the 2nd century, when we've looked at here, the worst persecutions were, after all, yet to come. I'm not saying that it's going to make the world love us, because the love of the world is really not what we're after anyway. You see, the persecutions, the hatred of Christians, it grew. It grew. Eventually it collapsed in on itself, but it did grow throughout much of this. We see this in something I'll just put in front of you called the Alexamenos graffito. This gives an image that tells us how the world looked at Christianity in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, 2nd, 3rd century in particular. This is scratched on a wall in the Palatine Hill in Rome, and it is a man being crucified, but with the head of a donkey, which was one of the worst things in terms of being mocking and making fun of. If somebody worshiping this image, and it says on there in Greek, Alexamenos sebete theon. Alexamenos worships God. Alexamenos worships God. This is something that has been scratched there to mock somebody named Alexamenos, who's a Christian. This is how they viewed Christianity. This is how they perceived the Christian faith. You may not realize this, but the very word cross in the ancient world, cross, crucifixion, crucify, was a bad word. It was actually a curse word. It was a cuss word. You didn't say it in polite company in most circumstances. You didn't say the word cross or crucify. They had other euphemisms. One of the ways that you recognize in ancient cultures if something is a bad word is if they have a lot of substitute words for it. That's true for us too. You start thinking about, oh yeah, where do we have the most substitute words? It's words you're not supposed to say in public. So we come up with a bunch of substitute words for it. Cross, they had bunches of substitute words to avoid saying it. They called it the criminal being. They called it the ultimate end. They called it the supreme penalty. They called it the extreme, the death of the slave. There's all sorts of things that they would call it, that they would use to refer to it to avoid saying crucify, crucifixion. It was vulgar. It was a bad word for them. This exemplifies that cultural sense right there of this is vulgar. It's awful. How could anybody worship such a God? And indeed, how could they? It would take something really momentous for somebody to worship a God who'd been crucified, wouldn't it? I mean, that'd be something really, imagine something that's actually a cuss word, and yet you're worshiping somebody that this happened to. It would take something like, imagine like a resurrection or something is what it would take for you to believe in such a God who did this. And indeed, that is what was required for them to trust in him. Jesus was raised from the dead, turned a grave into a groove, and turned a tomb into a temporary hotel, and then checked out alive and well. That's the God in whom we believe. But I want you to see this to understand that the world's not going to love us because we do these things. So why do we do these things? We do these things that I've mentioned because it will preserve the witness of Jesus Christ to the gospel, to the world around us. It will preserve us as people who love our neighbors despite every act of spite we may face, and our defenses may not convince the world that Christianity is good, but they will form us into people who are unashamed of the gospel that is the power of God for salvation. That's what it does. And so I want us to leave you with 3 different reminders. But But the overall thing I want you to see is that the life of the church formed a people that persisted past every persecution and every power that resisted God's truth. So what do we do with this? I want to give you three things. First off, as you're seeing the culture change around you, remind yourself that those who reject God's design aren't experiencing long-term satisfaction. It may look like it in the short term, but they aren't. Look at the stats. If you will look at the stats, you will see, for example, of those who are trying to embrace a transgender lifestyle, you will see that the incidences of things like depression and all sorts of suicidal ideation, all of those things are multiplied, and not because they're feeling resistance from others to their self-perception, but it's going together with those things. They're not experiencing long-term satisfaction. And here's what, I don't want to say this to gloat. Here's what I want us to see. The way of God provides a way that is far more satisfying than the world provides. And here's what I believe. Maybe I'm too optimistic, which is usually something never anyone says about me. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but it's this. I do believe that in a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, we are going to see people that are like, that didn't work. These things that we were saying that didn't work. I think we're going to see that. And even if we don't, it's still not going to work. It's still not going to work. And so don't feel like I have to be ashamed of saying, I, in Christ, am living a life that leads to long-term flourishing. That doesn't mean all our lives are perfect. I'm not trying to suggest that. I'm just saying that God's way provides a longer-term satisfaction than all the things that the world around us is trying to point to. And right now, it is being painted in such glorious terms and in such glorious ways that we don't recognize sometimes that underneath all of this, there is an undercurrent of hurt and depression and dissatisfaction that's there underneath. And as I said, I'm not saying that to gloat. I'm saying that for us to be confident and for us to be confident in pointing people to a better way. People aren't experiencing long-term satisfaction. Secondly, something I really want us to understand. People ask, what do I need to do to fight against the progressive sexual agenda, all the things we see around us? Let me tell you, the best thing you can do is raise your children and grandchildren to absolutely love the fact that God has made them male or female. Let them love that. Let them rejoice in that. I think there's a fascinating thing in Romans chapter 1. Paul says, he speaks of this degradation into a homosexual lifestyle and all the things he describes. And one of the things Paul says after that, pay attention to this, he says, they were not thankful. We can brush over that. They were not thankful or they were not grateful. Do you see what Paul's saying there? They weren't grateful for the gender that God had created them in. The best thing you can do is you want your children and grandchildren to rejoice in the gender that God has made them. Now here's one of the just practical things. Don't be people who are making fun of using jokes or anything like that mock female or male. It's easy to fall into that. Don't fall into these stereotypes that downgrade a gender in any way, shape, or form. Instead, you want your children to say, I am so glad God made me a girl. I am so glad God made me a boy. I'm so glad. I rejoice in that. Help your children to learn to rejoice in that. And I don't want to get into all the psychological research, but as you look into the psychological, sociological research in a lot of this, many of the struggles that people have, they can stem back to something where there's not wanting to be the gender that I am. Help your children to say, I love the fact that God made me this way. Say to your children, I love that God made you a boy. I love that God made you a girl. Be able to say that. If you want to really go to war against this, that's where you start. Start there. Start with helping your children and your grandchildren learn to love the way that God has made them. The third thing, I've already hinted at this, speak Speak what is true, but speak it with kindness and joy. Speak what is true, but speak with kindness and joy. Rage gets you a lot of clicks on the internet. Rage gives you a temporary dopamine hit. Rage doesn't attract people to the life you're proclaiming. Be joyful. I love being this. I love this. I'm speaking what is true to you, but I'm speaking it from a position of I love God's way, and I love you, and I want to rejoice in the way that God has created us. Speak with kindness and joy, not with rage and anger. Speak what is true, but speak with kindness and joy. And that brings me all the way back to that young woman that I described earlier, who came to our church and said, I believe in the evidence for the resurrection, but I don't want to become a Christian because you won't affirm what I perceive myself to be. That young woman, I lost track of her sadly during the pandemic. I think her family moved and we weren't able to keep track of her. But all the way up to the point that happened, she would follow the same pattern. She would come to church for a few weeks, and then she would say, I'm never coming back. I'm never coming back. Because we wouldn't affirm certain things she wanted affirmed. She'd be angry, walk out, I'm never coming back to church. 2-3 weeks later, she's back. And then she'd be there for a while, I hate this is so awful. And then 2-3 weeks later, come back. Now, I don't know for sure why, but I think I know. It's because given her home situation, her school situation, she was being loved at church in a way, even though she didn't believe what we believed, she was being loved in a way that nobody at home and nobody at school did. She still wasn't convinced that Christianity was good for her, but she knew Christians could be good to her. And I don't know what happened to her, but I do pray and believe that someday God will bring her to himself, and he will work through that. The church is evidence. That's what I want you to see. The care we give for one another in the church of people who are different from one another, that's inexplicable apart from a divine power. We as the church can do civic good without bowing to the gods of the culture. And not only that, but we have a consistency between what we practice and what we profess that is something that is explainable only by supernatural means. The church is evidence. And as I was preparing this, there was one other thing that came to my mind as I reflected back, and it's what caused me to look back to say 4 years ago this week we were here, because I remember that because of the fact that a few weeks after we left here 4 years ago, the whole world shut down. And our daughter, our oldest daughter, was one of the first to be diagnosed with COVID and was on a ventilator with basically zero chance of surviving. She was on a ventilator for over a month without a chance of surviving, according to all of the things that we were getting at that time. And not only that, in the midst of all of that, we had one of our other children who had an incident that had just caused a lot of trauma that came up as well. And in the midst of all of that, I went through several months and never actually slept an entire night of getting up and trying to make sure everybody's safe, and checking on things. Went through that. In the midst of that, I remember when we first started going back to church, I remembered realizing I don't have the energy to believe. Now, it wasn't that I disbelieved God. It wasn't that. It's just I realized for the first time, believing takes energy. And I didn't have it. I just didn't have the capacity to sing the songs. I didn't have the capacity to go through any of the motions that I'm supposed to go through. I didn't have the strength to believe. But I said this, just in my own mind, thinking and looking at the people around me, you all sing the songs I can't. You all have the faith I can't. And in the meantime, I'll just wait until I am able to do it again. And in that, what I realized is the church, in yet another way, becomes evidence that helps us to hold on to the faith. Because the church sometimes believes for you when you don't have the energy to muster up to do it. The church sings the songs for you when you are too broken to sing those songs. The church says the creeds for you when you still believe it in your heart, but you just don't have the energy to speak it outwardly. The church is evidence that holds us in the faith when we don't have the strength to do it. The church is evidence for the truth of the faith. And that's what I want us to see in the world we live in now, where the very goodness of Christianity is in question. The church has got to be put forward as evidence for the truth of the faith. There are things we do that cannot be explained by naturalistic evolution. There are ways we respond to the world that cannot be explained by any earthly explanation. There are ways that we help one another that the world has no category for. And God can work through that to show the world that there is something they need that they can find here. They can find here. Let's pray. God, I praise you for the time you give to us. I thank you for the goodness you pour out on our lives. I thank you for the gift of the church. And I pray that you will help us to see our church not merely as a social club or a conglomeration of people, but as evidence for the truth of the gospel. God, help us to see that. In your name, amen. Does anyone have any questions? Glad for that. If you want to, there's a way. Okay, questions. I am glad for us to interact in any way possible. In that, if you have questions about about anything I've said.
All right. The question is, if an unbeliever were in the room tonight, is what you said, how have you seen that, or could you see that to be convincing for Christianity for an unbeliever?
So let's think about, I will say first off, I designed what I said for Christians, and so I didn't do it the way I would do it with an unbeliever. So what I'll respond to that is how I would engage an unbeliever that way, is how I would do it. What I would do, and have done, engaging with non-Christians in what this, one of the main things is that if naturalistic evolution is true, there are things it should have eliminated that we do and practice in the church. So that's the way I would approach it with a non-Christian, is saying, look, what we ought to be doing and what ought to have been eliminated are things of being benevolent and gracious to people who are different from us. Evolution ought to eliminate that. But we're doing this all the time, and things of that nature. I would try to press in that to help them to see that it ought to eliminate that. And what I would want to be trying to do is help them to question that naturalistic explanation. So that's the first thing that I would do in that. The other thing I would appeal to in the church is something I only got a chance to barely hint at tonight, and that is that there is no reason the church should have taken off as a religious organization given the context it was in the Roman Empire. Hinted at that, but that's a huge thing. Like, there's no reason that Christianity ought to have been believed and followed and practiced and it ought to have grown. It's simply, everything is stacked against it in that, and yet it does. Yet it takes off. In that, there's an evidence for the supernatural. Now, on top of that, we eventually have to get to some evidences for the resurrection or something like that. We have to get there. But I want to use the church as a way of helping them to see that their naturalistic explanation of the world is not adequate. It's not adequate. There's something here that they can't explain in their naturalistic way, and that's the way I would want to do that with a non-Christian, and have done that, engaging with non-Christians. Great question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. How does the church differ from other faiths? How do we differ from that? So let's think through some of the things that we are doing that others aren't doing, aren't engaging in quite the same way. So one of the things that I want us to recognize is, let's just think broadly religions as a whole. that there is a call to love one another in a manner that most other religions don't. If they do, they are generally borrowing it from some part of the Judeo-Christian heritage, okay? So they're borrowing it from, and you can trace back that they are borrowing it from. So in Islam, for example, there's no calling to love one another in the way that we are. There may be a caring for one another, but again, it's a very tribal us against them type of caring for one another. It's not caring for people who are different from yourselves and those outside of your community. And that's in part because love, there's nothing eternal about love. Love has no transcendent quality. So just think about it for a moment. We believe love is transcendent and eternal because God is a Trinity. Father, Son, and Spirit love one another for all eternity. But if you have a God who is unitary, then God can't love until he creates. You can't love until he creates because there's nothing to love. He can't love. So love is contingent or dependent upon his creation. Love is temporary, not transcendent. And so there's a different type of love that we're talking about here. Whereas as Christians, because Father, Son, and Spirit loved each other for all eternity, there's an eternal love, and then we are called to a different type of sacrificial love for one another. And I would contend that any religion that is having this notion of a sacrificial love, you can make a great case for if it does have that, it borrowed it from Christianity rather than it being intrinsic to that religion. Good question.
That's good. Any questions on this side, anybody? Mike?
Yeah, the question is what about people who say the church hasn't been a caring place? Here's what I want us to do on that. I'm glad you asked that question. But we need to say, tell me about what you've experienced. Because here's what we have to do. We have to hear their story. We have to hear their story. Tell me about what you experienced. And a lot of times what we are going to end up doing is saying, I am so sorry that you experienced that. That isn't how Christians ought to act. We just own it and say people aren't acting in a Christian way, in a Christ-like way. Now, sometimes the way they're seeing that is something that may not be something that was unloving at all. But many of these people have truly and authentically experienced unloving Christians. And rather than us trying to defend and saying, oh, it was okay, it was really okay, or just get over it, we need to listen to their story. Because when we listen to their story and really hear what they have to say, then we can just own it and say, man, that wasn't how Christians ought to act at all. And here's what's encouraging to me. Justin Martyr, I referenced him earlier, in his first apology, written in the 2nd century, he actually deals with this question. He's presenting the church as an argument, and he says, but there are some who will say that Christians aren't acting this way. And Justin Martyr, 2nd century, says, you're right, there are Christians who aren't. And they're not acting in keeping with what Jesus actually said, and we ought to treat them as people who aren't acting that way. And I love that. That was so encouraging to me because for a long time I think I'd felt somehow, man, that's just a new thing. They didn't have to deal with it. No, Justin Martyr dealt with it in the 2nd century of people saying, Christians aren't acting this way. What about that? And he responds in exactly the way I'm saying here. You just own it and say, you're right, and I'm sorry that happened, and this is not acting in keeping with what Jesus wants us to act like. And then what I want to be able to do is to be in a church where I can say, just give it a chance. Come here and come with us, and let's take a look at this. There's an individual right now that that's quite literally happening with. He's been out of church for years. He's got a lot of church hurt and bitterness, and I'm saying, hey, just come and try it out and let me know how it's going for you, things like that. It's just so important to do that. Yeah, great question.
Great question. Any others? Patrick, I want to come to you just so that people can hear, but I got to move a little quicker than I was. So.
Dr. Jones, thank you very much. As you were speaking about the theory of evolution, what came to mind is that it appears that the evolutionist has added millions of years to when things have happened, probably because they can't explain the fact that evolution has stopped. Is that something?
I think that it's not so much that it has stopped, but it occurs for an evolutionist in such a slow manner that we wouldn't, what the evolutionists would argue is we can't observe it, and that's still happening. We can't observe it because it happens so slowly, but it requires this insertion of these millions, billions of years with random evolution occurring throughout that time. And so here's the thing on that I think is important and maybe interesting as you think about this. One of the key flaws with things like altruism or love being formed by evolution, okay, which they have to have some explanation for how we have these senses of love or altruism or things like that by means of evolution, is that those things only happen, they happen at a social level. They happen at a group level. Here's the problem. The mutations that produce evolutionary progress happen at an individual level. And by the time something could become worked into the population, it wouldn't be something advantageous anymore because you have to have two people to have it at the same time. If you have one person that's loving it, that has a mutation that has produced that in one person and not in anybody else, it's useless. And so, but it happens is those things only work at a social level. So you would have to posit, which is astronomically impossible, that the same mutation occurs multiple times within a same group for it to work, and it just can't. It's just impossible for that to happen on that. It's one of those things. Social things that are social goods have to happen at a group level. But evolutionary mutations only happen at individual levels. And so it makes it an impossibility for it to produce those things. And it's just a fascinating thing if you start thinking about that. There's a book called Beyond Evolution by a guy named Anthony O'Hear, and he unpacks all this. This is something I came up with but he unpacks all this. It's brilliant on that, how that doesn't work that way.
Anyone else?
So what now?
She wants a definitive answer, exact age of the world.
Okay. So I will actually say, I think this is something Christians can have different perspectives on, okay? I am an old earth, non-evolutionary creationist. That is to say, I do believe the earth is old, but I don't believe it's old because it needs evolution. I just think God in his plan worked it out over a long period of time of millions to billions of years. Not because I don't believe in evolution of a sort of it explaining things. But I do think that it is older. But other Christians believe the earth is much 10,000, 6,000 years old. This is something Christians can still believe the Bible and have different perspectives on, and that's okay. What I want to do is for all of us to be united against a naturalistic evolution. So what I will always want to do is the person who believes that the earth is 10,000 years old, I'm going to link arms with them just readily to be against something that is our common opponent in that, which is the notion of an earth that is somehow comes about by millions of years and requires that because it comes about by random chance. And so I don't have a definitive answer to the exact age of the earth. I do have a definitive answer of what we need to stand against together, whatever our perspective is on that. I do not believe the Bible tells us definitively how old the earth is on that. And that's why I think it's something that we can have different perspectives on. When it comes to the very beginning of time and the very end of time, we may have there's different views that people have that are still within His Word and trusting in His Word. Good question.
So that would probably fall under what Dr. Moeller calls theological triage.
Yes, yeah. So there's what are called. This is actually a really helpful thing. You mentioned that. So there are first order issues or primary issues that if you disbelieve those, you're not a Christian. There are second order issues, secondary issues, and those are these issues that everybody in your church needs to agree on, but it's within. So, for example, baptism. We can't be baptizing by immersion and by sprinkling, or babies and believers. We've got to decide on one of those. So that's within your church. That's that second order issue where you believe that Presbyterians are Christians, but you can't really join the same church as the Presbyterian if you're a Baptist. That's a second order issue. The third order issues, which is what this is, are ones within our church we can agree to disagree on that issue or have a variety of perspectives. And it's really important for us to think through those and think through those well on that.
We probably have maybe 1 minute. Any one or more question, perhaps? Let me ask one closing question. You've presented this presentation in different venues, college students, young adults, churches, and then in the position of apologetics being something that some are very familiar with and others in the church are not as familiar with, and yet there's also this, my experience, when you speak apologetics, some are thinking, oh good, I'm going to get me five smooth stones so I can go throw it at somebody when I want to have a theological debate. So what do you think is the biggest need for apologetics teaching in the local church, and what are some of the maybe the potholes and the things to avoid that are so maybe attractional to that degree that may lead us away from really what we need in an apologetics understanding?
So interesting, the thing I think is most important today is actually for us to learn to interpret the Bible well. That may seem like a strange thing, but what I want you to understand is most of the challenges we're having right now are because people don't know how to interpret the Bible well. And so let's give an example of this. It's been a year or two since I looked at it, but this 16-year-old kid on a TikTok going through how that homosexuality wasn't invented as being something unacceptable to the 1700s. He's like, it's just nonsense, utter nonsense. Like 16 million views. But you think about that, this ultimately, he's using the Bible. He's saying that the Bible doesn't really say this. This was translators that messed it up and things like that. But this caught on with millions of people. And that's an issue of interpretation, interpreting the Bible well, learning to interpret the Bible. So interesting, I do think the number one thing is learning to interpret the Bible well. Okay, that's the number one thing. That we need to train one another, help one another to be able to understand and read and interpret the Bible well. Now, beyond that, when we're speaking of specifically about apologetics, okay, I think that there are two areas that we have to be able to be able to defend, and that is what I've hinted at tonight is to be able to understand that the Bible's way is good, and to be able to articulate to a non-Christian why the Bible's way is good. And that's something a lot of us are really lost when it comes to. How do I explain that the Bible's good for us? And I think it's really important. The other one is, and this is something that I think is a perennial question, is where do I start when somebody actually says, I don't believe what you believe? Give everybody a starting place. And there's two things. One, just to be able to say why it's good. The second one is, what is my starting place when somebody says, I don't believe what you believe? Because a lot of people are just like, oh, at this point, I don't know what to say. When somebody says, I don't believe that Christianity is true, I think it's false, they just don't know what to say. And so just one of the biggest things is to have, I know the first thing I'm going to say when that person says that. And to be able to do that. And what I would encourage you to be able to say is, well, what do you think about the resurrection of Jesus? Do you think he was really raised from the dead? Because if they believe that, then and they aren't a Christian, then that's going to open up some things. If they don't believe that, then that says, well, that gives you a chance to talk about evidence for it, things like that. So, but just have something you can say when somebody says, I don't believe. That's it. That's it. So if I say two little things that everybody can do to become an apologist, know what you're going to say when somebody says, I don't believe what you believe. And the other one is, can I tell somebody who's not a Christian, why Christianity is not merely true, but why it's good for us? That's the two things I really think we need to be able to do.
I appreciate that. What a great word. And one last, you didn't ask me to do this, but your newest book, In Church as It Is in Heaven, co-authored, is that right?
Yes, co-authored with Jamal Williams, our one of the other pastors at our church. In Church as It Is in Heaven, it is basically saying how a multi-ethnic, multi-generational, and multi-socioeconomic church can actually be an argument for the truth of the gospel. And we're in the midst of living that, and that's what we're doing in there. And as I said earlier, the world's ways are just not working. They're failing miserably. And so there's a chance for us to say, look, we have a better way. And so it's In Church as It Is in Heaven.
You can get that at Amazon and anywhere else you want to buy a book, right? Yeah. So, TimothyPaulJones.com?
Yeah, yes,
Check out his website. Great articles on there, great information. We are so thankful that you decided to take your vacation when you did, and that you are coming back through Jacksonville, and praying for safe journey for you back to Kentucky tomorrow.
Yes.
Is that right? Heading back. So let's say thank you to Dr. Jones and
Thank you.
his time with us.